So a little over a decade ago, I found myself in the parking lot of a building here in Tampa talking to a man that we'll call Arthur. Arthur was a single dad. He was invited to this charity event that we had hosted that we called Affordable Christmas. Affordable Christmas is set up in a way for families to come and shop and get new unused items for their kids for Christmas at an affordable cost to them. As I'm standing there in the parking lot with Arthur, we're talking about the items that he got for his kids. He's bragging about his son and daughter, single dad, and he's telling me the story about his son. One of the items that he bought was a brand new bicycle. And I just see the person walking these out with him, and I'm pushing this bicycle and ask him who this bicycle is for. And he starts telling me the story about his son, bragging on his son, makes good grades, all these things. And he said the one thing that he asked for Christmas this year was a bicycle. And I looked at my son when he said that, and he said, "Don't get your hopes up, because Dad can't afford that this year." And then the next statement that he said to me completely changed how I view life, how I view how we interact with people, and how we help people. His next sentence after saying, "I told my son, don't get your hopes up because Dad can't afford it." What he said next was, "Now I get to go home and be the hero to my son." I get to be the hero. That one sentence hit me in the face like a ton of bricks. Because what it did for me in that moment was recognizing how often I put myself in the hero seat for someone else's story, rather than creating a scenario for them to be the hero to their own story and their own family. And as I stood there and he said that, it took me back to years earlier when I worked for a church. And we did a similar Christmas thing, but we did it completely different. What we did in the scenario years earlier at this church that I worked for is we had families in our community that we knew, and people even in our church that were financially unstable. They were struggling, especially when it comes to the holidays, as many families do. And what we decided to do was, let's surprise these families. Let's bring them here for this particular church service around Christmas time. We'll get a list of what their kids want for Christmas that they can't afford it. And we'll give these out to the people in our church, and they'll go buy these gifts. They'll gift wrap them. They'll have them come to the church service that day, and we're going to surprise these families with Christmas that morning. So picture this. These families have no idea what's going on. They get called up. We line them up in front of a stage. Christmas carols are being sung. And here comes all these strangers from the audience, pulling gifts out from under their seats and bringing them up front, finding the family, finding the kid that their gift is for, bringing it to that kid, and they're unwrapping it right there, and kids are excited, everything's going crazy. But what it reminded me when I stood there with Arthur, and Arthur said, "I get to be the hero to my son," it reminded me of a family years earlier and that church experience that we'll call the Smith family. And I vividly remember Mr. Smith standing there behind his kids with these strangers coming up, handing them wrapped gifts. His kids are unwrapping it, so excited about this thing that they asked for Christmas that their dad didn't get them, but a stranger got for them. And I remember the look of shame and embarrassment on his face in that moment. And realizing, as I stood there with Arthur, that for Arthur, we had created a scenario where Arthur could be the hero to his story and to his family. We gave him empowerment and dignity in that moment. For Mr. Smith, years earlier, he went home with shame and embarrassment, while someone else was the hero to his kids. What I learned that day with Arthur is that how we do something is just as important as what we do. When it comes to business, when it comes to our customers, when it comes to our employees, how we work with them and how we treat them and how we interact in their story is just as important as what we do. Typically, we think through marrying two things together. Typically, we think about what and why. That's usually how we view our lives. We want to know, we think about what are we doing and why are we doing it? We want our lives to matter. We want our work to matter. And so we maybe identify a need. Someone within our company or someone within our community, we see a need that we can meet, and so we go and try to do it. The problem oftentimes, though, is we don't take the next step and think through, is how I'm providing this service empowering and dignifying to the people that I am providing this service to? The real love story is not what and why. The real love story is what and how. Because the how is the hard one. Why? Easy. If we have any kind of heart, we have any kind of compassion, why is easy to come up with. We see a need, let's meet that need. Or there's a place in the market that's being untapped, let's do that. And then we think of what? Okay, it's easy. Someone's hungry, we hand them food. We've just done what? But we don't often think through the next step of how I'm providing this to this person or to these people or to this community. Does it create a scenario for them that they get to be the hero to their story? Or are we the hero to their story on their behalf? We see this a lot in philanthropy. In fact, there's a great example of this right after World War II. The Allied countries, so everything was done, the Allied countries came together and realized we got to do something to help rebuild these countries that are war-torn from World War II. And so they created what we know as the World Bank. The World Bank went to work on financially infusing resources into these war-torn countries to help rebuild them, to rebuild their infrastructure, to rebuild their economies. And it worked very well. Many of these countries advanced very quickly because of the resources that they pulled together and put into these countries. And so as time goes by, they're working on these particular countries, and they realize it's working here. We have a lot of undeveloped nations that have bad economics and need this kind of resources. So they took what they were doing with these allied countries and these war-torn countries and tried to transfer that to undeveloped nations. And several decades go by and they realize it's not working. These countries are not advancing in the same way that the already previously developed nations were working. It's not working the same. What's the problem? Like, they realized it was working in France, but it didn't work in places like India. They realized there's some short-term things that they were accomplishing. Again, someone in that community is hungry. We hand them food, and we give them a resource of food in that moment. It solves the short-term problem, but it didn't solve the long-term sustainable solution. So they took a pause and they went, all right, let's talk to these. Let's go beyond the agencies. Let's go beyond the governments. Let's go and on the ground talk to families and people in these communities, in these countries, not only in the developing nations, but also in the nations that we have helped and it has worked. Let's figure out where it's going wrong. And they published volumes of research and data that they came up with from both sides. And there's a couple of quotes that I want to read you from some of the developing nations and some of these lower income, impoverished people that they talked to in this research. This is one of the responses they got. For a poor person, everything is terrible. Illness, humiliation, shame. We are cripples. We are afraid of everything. We depend on everyone. No one needs us. We are like garbage that everyone wants to get rid of. That was their experience. Another one said this: when one is poor, she has no say in public. She feels inferior. She has no food, so there is famine in her house, no clothing, and no progress in her family. Another one from Cameroon said this: the poor have a feeling of powerlessness and an inability to make themselves heard. What they came to terms with from not only these kinds of statements and the research and data they found there, but also contrasted with the research and data that they found in the developed nations, was what they discovered is that They were treating the symptom, not the actual problem. The symptom was someone's hungry, their financial instability, whatever. But the real problem that they discovered is what they called the poverty of being. That both sides of the equation struggled with the poverty of being. Poverty of being for the poor person in those communities and the developing nations was exactly what you heard in those statements. Lack of power, lack of agency, lack of the ability to provide as they needed to. Conversely, the poverty of being for the developed nation, for the financially stable, was what we know of as the God complex. I have resources. I see a problem. I can fix that problem. And that's typically what we charge headfirst into. Not thinking about is how I'm fixing this problem, helping raise the undeveloped, the financially unstable, to a better position in the long term. A book called When Helping Hurts summarized all this data and what they discovered in this moment and said this, and now we have come to a very central point. One of the biggest problems in many poverty alleviation efforts is that their design and implementation exacerbates the poverty of being of the economically rich, their God complexes, and the poverty of being in the economically poor, their feelings of inferiority and shame. The way that we act toward the economically poor often communicates, albeit unintentionally, that we are superior and they are inferior. In the process, we hurt the poor and ourselves. We hurt them and ourselves when we don't think through how, when we don't marry how and what together. As I stood there with Arthur, thinking about Mr. Smith, thinking about Arthur's story, realizing oftentimes in the case of Mr. Smith, I hurt not only myself, but him by not helping him be the hero to his story. And Arthur went home with being empowered. Marcus Aurelius has a famous statement that says, what we do now echoes in eternity. And that's a very true statement, but I would amend it because I think it's incomplete. I think the complete statement, the truest, purest statement would be what we do now and how we do it echoes in eternity. We will be remembered for what we do, but we will also be remembered for how we did what we do. Because how is just as important as what. Thank you.